What a treat it's been. I'm so sorry I haven't been able to join you all until the weeest hours of the morning with the drinking that goes on in this country. I promise tonight I'm in, at least for a couple. Two things I'm not going to discuss in my talk, and we can talk about afterwards if you like. The green stuff, green is good, I'm with you, but there just wasn't time. And the mistakes you all habitually make, according to psychologists in your work, that's bad, stop it. And we can talk about that afterwards too. We're going to hit the feel good here. So I do bring good news, and that is the evidence suggests that your work is the most important work in the world. You're not just building and shaping cities and communities, you're shaping people's lives. Your work will determine whether people are healthy or sick, whether they are connected or disconnected, whether they are rich or poor, and whether they are immersed in lives of hardship and misery or bathed in the joys that cities can provide. And to help explain this, I want to start with a story, which might seem inexplicable to you, but by the end, all will be revealed, okay? So, in 2011, I was invited by the Guggenheim Museum to partake in an urban laboratory, an ephemeral urban laboratory in this empty lot in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And they kept calling it a lab. And they had lots of money from BMW, and they kept calling it a lab, and I said, great, if you keep calling it that, then I get to conduct some experiments. Let's take some of their money and do some crazy things. So one of these experiments was this. Could we turn this essentially empty lot into a machine for building feelings of trust and conviviality, of liking amongst New Yorkers for one night only? Now, I'm from a village on the west coast of Canada, basically, and I was really scared after they agreed to this. So I realized what I needed was an interdisciplinary team, a sort of team of superheroes to help me. So I reached out first to psychologists, and they said, well, it's very simple. You have to serve hot chocolate. And I said, okay, well, that sounds very deep. But they said, no, really. Our research has shown that just holding something warm causes you to have warmer feelings about the people around you. It's almost as though it has a metaphorical effect on your psyche. And they said, but you need to serve everyone 2 cups of hot chocolate, and the rule is you hand the second cup to somebody at the back of the line. I said, fine, you guys are in. And then there was an artist pasting this sort of low-cost work around New York City. His name was Ryan Bredin, and the work was called Stranger, Unstranger. It's pretty obvious, right? You put your hand there, a stranger puts their hand there, and you can't leave until you're not strangers anymore. I know this is not English-type stuff. Just bear with me, okay? It's going to get worse. So Ryan was in because he was cheap and brilliant. Then it's New York City, and I was so excited, so I went to every party I could, and you meet these people. For example, a professor of fashionable technology, and this was after about 5 drinks, and I was like, fashionable technology? I don't know what you do, but you have to come to our experiment and do something. And it turns out one of the things they did, well, she organized her students, and they created a series of heat-sensitive garments. In other words, when you get close to each other, they change colors. So my assistant here is literally changing my heart, which I thought was cool. So they were in. We did many other things, too. We invited Project for Public Spaces in to show people images of people being nice to each other in public. We got the lighting right. It went on and on. One more intervention I'll tell you about. I have a friend named Paul Zak. He calls himself a neuroeconomist. So unlike the other economists who just invent crazy theories about how we behave in the world, he actually looks for evidence in the human body. So this is his favorite molecule, which is oxytocin. Women will know oxytocin. It's the hormone you are flooded with after you give birth so you don't kill your screaming child. Or maybe that's a bit strong. I live with children, so anyway, you get the warm and fuzzies. It's the trust hormone. But the truth is, Paul's work has revealed that all of us get a dose of oxytocin every time we have a trust-building encounter with a friend or even strangers. So I said, great, Paul, what will be your peer-reviewed experiment at our night here? And he said, I've got it. He said, we're going to get people to hug for an hour, hug strangers all night long. And everywhere else, they laugh at this point. But you're all horrified, aren't you? Said, we're not in North America anymore. And actually, Paul was in California. I said, Paul, this is New York City. Come on, it's not going to happen. But he refused to come unless I agreed to the hug. So I said, fine, let's do it. And so the night came, in early October. It was a dry, beautiful night. We opened the gates, we got the place ready, and we waited for New Yorkers to come. And before I tell you what happened, I should give you a little bit of context. As you can imagine, at the time I was writing my book, Happy City, which is still for sale outside. And this research had convinced me that our cities indeed can change the way we feel, they can change the way we move, and they change the way we treat other people in ways most of us don't even imagine. And this led me to conclude that indeed the city can be designed in ways that boost human happiness or take us to misery. So our goal really must be, if it's possible, if we can do it, we need to be building cities for happiness. Now, it's not a kooky idea. Some of our greatest thinkers have been pushing happiness for thousands of years. You know, Aristotle was out in the Agora in ancient Athens calling for policymakers and individuals to pursue a kind of happiness. You know, Freud pointed out it's the end result of every action we take, even if your goal is to be kind of miserable, sitting at home over your lukewarm beer, which is fine too. And you know, the Americans have woven happiness into their Constitution. I think it was one of your comedians, Eddie Izzard, who pointed this out. He's like, yeah, the Americans are like, there's happiness, gonna pursue it. Got it. So, you know, we're out there pursuing it. The question is, the tricky question is, if you're going to work to build happiness, first of all, you have to figure out what you mean by it. But what is the magic equation that will take us to happiness? And actually, I think some of the work on that problem began here during the Enlightenment. Jeremy Bentham and colleagues tried to identify pleasure and pain, tried to identify these emotions, and they failed. And you know what happened next, right? The economists stepped up and said, well, look, you can't measure pleasure and pain, you can't do the happiness thing, so we're going to take over. And what we can do is identify a proxy. We'll just watch how people spend their money, and that will tell us what makes them happy. And obviously, if you can spend more money, then you're happier, right? Well, this has led us to this ridiculous situation where our systems are basically based on boosting GDP. So suicide, tornadoes, earthquakes, divorce, these are all supposedly good for society because they increase economic activity. The economists are coming around, actually. So the behavioral economists actually have produced this one. Gary Becker actually won the Nobel Prize for Economics for not this work in particular, but you know what this means, right? Any guesses? Okay, I'll take you through it to the best of my ability. It's called the evolutionary happiness function. It's theoretical economics, but based, well, you know, theory. You are going to try to get happy by buying lots of stuff and boosting your personal status, and it will work temporarily, and then it'll stop working. And in fact, that's how we're built. They were using not just evolutionary theory, but evidence we've seen from the field as well, that, you know, the new house, the big screen TV, they stop making us happier after about 3 months. So where does this leave us? Well, fortunately, actual scientists have been looking into happiness and well-being from the fields of, say, public health, psychology, behavioral psychology, neuroscience, and yes, even the behavioral economists. And what they found is, you know, quite remarkable. First of all, they found that people who say they're happy are happy. And this is an important point, actually, because this wasn't believed for the longest time. But in fact, people who self-report on happiness show higher levels of activity in the pleasure centers of their brain, lower levels of stress hormones like cortisol in their systems. They're less likely to check into hospital. They're less likely to see a doctor about depression and other mental issues. They're more productive at work, and they live longer. So it's kind of like Aristotle said, happiness, it's a good thing, right? It's good for the economy even. But still, this doesn't get us to the magic equation. What are the ingredients of human happiness? How are we going to guide our actions? So there's a lot of debate about this, but what I tried to do is take lessons from these various fields, the ones I just mentioned, and come up with a basic recipe that might help urbanists, designers, planners, system thinkers. I'm going to rip through it because there's one element we need to focus on today, okay? So if I'm going too slowly through this brain diagram, put up your hand, and I'll speed along, okay? And something else I meant to tell you. I'm talking for 40 minutes, maybe 45, if we do a fun thing in the middle. So, set your watches, and just know that in about 10 minutes, I might make you stand up. So, what are the ingredients of this soup of happiness? Obviously, you need to meet your core needs. Food, shelter, security. Duh, right? They were right in the Enlightenment. Pleasure is better than pain. A dessert of ice cream is better than a dessert of razor blades. Health, very important, but actually, feeling healthy is more important than being healthy. You can feel healthy until the day you keel over, and that's a great life, isn't it? The economists were right, income matters. It's much better to be rich than to be poor, but if you're considering societal happiness, you've got to think about equity. Who has access to the riches of society, of life, and particularly the city? Over here, the psychologists jump in. They say mastery. In other words, a feeling that you can get through the course of your everyday, through your work, or through your city, without feeling like the system is crushing you. A sense of freedom. I kind of throw this one in for the Americans. They love their freedom, but what sometimes the Americans forget is that with freedom comes the responsibility, or should, to pay for the choices you make. Pay for those full costs. So that's why we throw it in here. Having a sense of meaning in your life and a sense of belonging to place and community. These things are very important for self-reported happiness, and they are strongly related to social ties. And the reason why this font is big is because nothing matters more to human happiness than social connectedness. Nothing at all. And to help explain that, I'll give you one of what will be just a few graphs, all right? This is data from Canada comparing life satisfaction with trust in neighbors. And what you see here very immediately is a strong correlation. If you don't know Canada, you may not realize that here are all our big, rich cities down here at the bottom, just sucking on happiness, but also on local trust. St. John is kind of a backwater. There's nobody from the Maritimes here, are there? Okay. Kind of a backwater on the East Coast, small city, but high trust. This isn't telling us that money doesn't matter. It's telling us that even though money matters, trust matters even more. Relationships, more than anything. So we know that people who are socially connected with family, friends, and community, like my Mexican in-laws here, look at them going crazy. This happens, it actually never stops. I find it a bit much. But the point is, people who are socially connected, this list will seem familiar to you. More productive at work, self-reporting higher happiness, less likely to check into hospital, more likely to survive cancer, and they live up to 15 years longer than people who are socially disconnected. 15 years longer. And I think the thing that's significant for urbanists is this notion of relationships with other people in the city. It goes well beyond your family and friends. The psychologist Elizabeth Dunn actually had her students follow people around the city and note their encounters. And then they asked them how happy they were at the end of the day. Typical life satisfaction question. Trust or happiness in the moment. What they found is people who had lots of superficial encounters with strangers were the happiest of all. They were even happier than people who had lots of encounters with family and friends, as some of us can probably understand. The point is, those superficial encounters really matter. In some ways because they're easier and we put our best face on. We also know that cities that maximize face-to-face contact are better on creativity. There's a correlation with patent applications and GDP growth in cities. So this whole happy, slappy unicorn thing, it's good for the economy. We see this on a national level and we see it on a city level. Trust is good, relationships are crucial. So that's what we need to be working on if we care about building a robust city. So the happy city itself is, above all, a social city. It's all those other things, but I want to talk about the social city today. This is the focus. So, the deal is that we think we can build or break our social lives through our own actions. In fact, we do have agency, but the city has agency on us. Our cities are actively designing sociability into or out of our lives all the time. An example. This is a Swiss study of German data, but we're seeing this from all over the world. the longer people's commutes are, the less happy they say they are with their entire lives. So this isn't saying, oh, people don't like their commutes, because we know that, right? Commutes suck. What this data is telling us is that people are choosing longer commutes to get a bigger house or a higher paying job, and those factors are not mitigating the discomfort of the commute. So in other words, again, the economists were wrong. We are not behaving like economic man with full information, making great decisions, at least judging by this data. What I was curious about is what is it specifically about long commutes which make us unhappy? Well, there's one. This is from a study done by the paper in my hometown, actually. So I pulled this from the paper, so it's fine to show here. Sorry, I got a vision in my head of the Danish mayor with the see, I'm not going that far. Anyway, what the paper found was people reported experiencing much more incivility and rudeness while driving in their cars than in any other way of moving around the city. In other words, people were much nicer when they were walking, and they were even nicer when they were on transit, going through the difficulty of transit. So this is part of it, but it's not the whole story. The rest of the story is this. I know it's about, 4:45 now? Just as you're falling asleep, I'm going to take you through this. I'm not going to do the data. Social interaction potential. So geographers in the USA punched a whole bunch of data into a supercomputer for tens of millions of Americans looking at all their big cities. And the question was this: what are the chances that any two people in a city could meet up for an ice cream or a beer or something after work? A theoretical hour-and-a-half window. And they acknowledged that, and here's the hard part, that people aren't just moving across space, they're moving across time. So we're all living our lives, our social lives, on the space-time continuum. So if my prism of availability in space and time doesn't intersect with yours, we're not meeting up. Simple as that. And what they found was, there are many factors influencing whether people can meet up, but one of them has the greatest influence of all. They called it dispersal. We have other words for it, like sprawl. The degree to which we have spread out functions in the city across the miles. Which is a terrible thing to hear, isn't it? Because it's what we've been doing for a century. So here we have Florida. And you see that you live here, you work over there, you drive the kids over here, you shop over here. It's very familiar to you because, or should be, because if you zoom in on a city like Birmingham, you're starting to see the same thing. I wanted to talk briefly about the system effects of these two systems. So again, let's pick on the Americans because it's easier for now. We've got Atlanta. This is Midtown Atlanta. So it's not downtown, but it was an old streetcar inner suburb. Tight street grid, high intersection density, walkable, mixed use, lots going on. You can reach everything on foot. Over here, we have a auto-dependent, single-use community on the edge of the city. This should be very familiar to people from the Midlands, but it is called Mableton, on the edge of Atlanta. If you try and walk from there to there and ask Google, how do I do this, you get a warning. It says, no sidewalks. Why would they bother? So what are the system effects? I'm not going to talk about the GHG emissions because nobody seems to care enough about that. I'm not going to talk about the effect on the poor, although this is a terrible place to be poor. In the USA, I'm not sure about here during the financial crisis, but in the USA, the people who lost their homes were out there. They weren't in here. They were on the edge because they were paying something like $800, what's that, 400 pounds a month in transportation costs alone, just to get to work. They lost everything, those people. We won't worry about that. Health effects, same person living out there, 10 pounds heavier. Same person living out there is going to lose about 4 years of their life if they continue to live out there. Why? Because the city is designing walking and active mobility out of their lives. Simple as that. But this is the factor that really struck me and really saddened me, actually, given the importance of sociability. People who live in exurban America, again, because the data is best coming from the States. It's better than the data I could find in the UK. There's just more of it, and better than what I can find in Canada. So people in car-dependent communities on the exurban edge in the USA, here's what they're reporting. Less likely to know their neighbors as people in connected community, less likely to have them over for dinner, less likely to play on a soccer, football team, or any other team sport, less likely to volunteer, join a community group, or even vote. because the city is sucking away their time. I think as a Swedish study found, this trickles into your life. So people with a one-way commute of more than 40 minutes are more than 45% more likely, 45% more likely to be divorced after 10 years than people who have a short walk to work. It affects everything. So, bringing it on home, here we have Birmingham, way up there. And I think these pictures are very important because we see that so much of discussions over the last couple of days have been about revitalizing the core. And this is important work. But there also needs to be a massive suburban retrofit in all of your big cities. And to illustrate the urgency of this, I picked on a little cul-de-sac down in Wythall. Does anybody know where that is? Okay. Do you live there? Okay. So here's a cul-de-sac. We run it through Walk Score, and their data algorithm isn't as good for the UK, but it kind of works. And it's getting a Walk Score of 20. Almost all errands require a car. However, you can walk to the Transportation Museum. All right. So, forget about it. You can't walk to the train. If you want to walk to a proper grocery store, it's going to be 42 minutes. So forget it. So the same dynamics, the same system dynamics are happening here. And we all know, because we've been discussing it for years, and certainly in the last 3 days, that the challenge is, how are we going to give more of us a chance to live a little bit closer together so that we can build those system efficiencies and social dynamics? And it's not easy. And I think to illustrate that point, I don't have any of BMW's money or any of our devices from the lab here, but I'd like to conduct a quick experiment. First of all, actually, put up your hands if you're kind of feeling tired and you want to stand up. It's not a trick. Okay, I'm sorry, put up your hands if you don't want to stand up right now. Okay, good. The next question, in that case, we're going to do this all together. Put up your hand if you do not want to participate in this experiment, and that's fine if you don't. It's about social proximity. Okay, you're out. Anyone else? Okay, I'll be watching you. We're going to move through this you're running away. We're going to move very, very quickly here. And this is going to be a challenge. I need to ask you one more question. Do most of you feel as though there are strangers in this room who you haven't met yet? Hands up if you think there are people here you haven't met yet. Oh, great. Okay. So I'm giving you 30 seconds. Okay? Your job is to find someone you don't know yet, and you share with them something nice or horrible that happened to you in public space the past week, say. You have to move quickly. You find them, you share it, they share back, and that's it. And once you're done, don't move. Continue to stand there, please. And so, yeah, you can get up and walk around. And groups of 3 are okay if you don't have to feel left out. But when I say go, go fast. Go. Stop talking. Stop. Don't move. Stop. Shh. Okay, a little feedback. How was that? Was that okay? Was that bad for anybody? Hands up. It was bad for you, Kevin. Somebody buy this guy a beer. Yeah, okay. Okay. So what we usually find is that feels okay, right? You're able to control your relationship, and that's nice. Meeting someone new, you get an immediate hormonal hit, the good kind, not necessarily the sexual kind. Part 2, and you're still standing where you are. What I need you to do, and we'll move, just pay attention. Turn to the person with whom you are engaging. Make eye contact, and now I need you to start moving closer together. Be quiet. Just move closer together. Now press your foreheads against each other and your cheek. No? Okay, good. Sit down. Sit down. You're done. You got one. I'm sorry. Thank you for indulging me. Stop talking. This is serious time. Stop it. Stop. Okay, now back to the boring lecture. Look, so what we all experience there is what they're learning in labs and through brain science, which is this. Casual social contact is awesome. But when you can't control your relationship or your proximity to other people, or you feel pushed too close, you back off. We all do. And this flows through all sorts of aspects of our urban life and design. So we had a mayor in Canada. His name was Rob Ford. Maybe you've heard of him. He had an expression for people, elitists who live downtown. He called them the latte-sipping downtown elite. Are there any of you here? Hands? No. Okay, I'm okay, well, you may have been feeling a little bit smug earlier when we talked about some social disconnection occurring on the ex-urban fringe. And you shouldn't, because the one place where people are reporting social trust as low or even lower than on the ex-urban fringe is in the residential tower. In fact, decades of surveys have found that people in towers are most likely to report feeling lonely and crowded at the very same time for those issues of proximity. So, this is a bit of a problem for me because I'm from Vancouver and we like to tell the world about the Vancouverist model. Even in our high-status, glitzy, high-amenity, very expensive vertical downtown neighborhoods, we're seeing these results. It's considered a crisis in our city now. People, for example, who live on the ground are reporting doing more favors for neighbors and having more trust in neighbors. So social disconnection is one of our biggest civic issues in the city now. So what do we do about that? I think we need to drill into what's happening in some of these buildings. So let me take you into one of these Vancouverist towers. This is called the 501. It was one of the early Vancouverist towers, and they were quite pleased with the way it worked out. You have a tall, thin tower, so everybody gets a view, and you've got 3-story podium base with an active street edge. Very Jane Jacobsy, right? At least on the bottom half. Everybody likes it. Now I want to introduce you to the rest of the typology. On the 3rd floor balcony, you have this volleyball court, because it was kind of a great marketing tool when this building was created. And a garden, a lovely area, actually. So, everybody shares it. Now, this is Rob, failed city council candidate. Nice guy. And there's a correlation there. Anyway, that wasn't nice. So anyway, Rob, years ago, bought an apartment in the tower. Loved it. Had his friends over for dinner. And it was great. They looked out across the city, and they felt like kings. And then his friends left, and he sat there alone. It was all right, too. He was a shy person. And then he noticed something. He had one group of friends who bought one of these townhouses at the base. The townhouses had front porches leading onto this garden area. And every weekend, there would be these volleyball and cocktail parties. And he felt very left out. And the thing is, it was only the townhouse dwellers who were using the space, none of the tower dwellers. He'd step into the elevator, ride it down, not talk to his neighbors. It was awful. So he sold his place, moved down to the townhouse, because back then nobody wanted the townhouses. It was a strange new typology. And within weeks, he knew all his neighbors' names, all of them. Within months, he was babysitting their kids. A few years later, I interviewed him, and he had keys to all his neighbors' houses. They were going on vacations together. And I said, well, okay, then how many of these people would you say you love? And he said, love like family? I said, yeah. He said, maybe 6 or 7. Well, consider, I don't know what the stats are in the UK, but in the USA, the average American says they can only trust 1.5 people on the planet. I mean, it's very sad to hear, but just see the bright side. Look what happened to our shy guy, Rob. So what's happening here? Is design responsible? We have no way of knowing because nobody does proper post-occupancy surveys these days, but you need to start. But let's look into the space. Number one, they all have these narrow front patios. And you know from Jan Gehl's work is the soft zone in front is very important. In fact, Gehl studied interactions in Canadian front yards, and he found the ideal front yard depth in Canada for having people out there talking was exactly 10.8 feet. So maybe these are a bit narrow, but they have this soft zone where they can advance or retreat as they wish. But there's another element, too, at play. I mean, it's not all about the front porch. And it's this. I had a discussion with Robin Dunbar, you know, the evolutionary anthropologist who came up with Dunbar's number. It has to do with the size of our cranium and how much information we can store about social relationships, essentially. Anyway, Dunbar pointed out that every time we encounter someone, we're making an unconscious calculation about whether we can trust them or not, whether we should include them in our friend network. Well, here we have the condo dwellers. There's about 24 of them entering their semi-private realm every day. Over in the tower, you've got more than 300 people cycling through the elevator. So as Dunbar mentioned to me, and again, he's speculating, he believes it's just too much work to do that calculation. So what do? You just back off. So this isn't to condemn all towers. This is just to say perhaps we can be a little bit more imaginative, more experimental, and offer more variety in our residential typologies as we densify our cities. So, more row houses, more townhouses, and I love this concept of the missing middle. Check out this website, missingmiddle.com. Nothing to do with me, I just thought I should credit them. They're pointing out that middle housing, walk-ups, semi-detached, which I know you have a lot of here, small apartment buildings, these used to be mixed into the fabric. And in so many places, they're not anymore. They've been zoned out of existence, or for whatever reason, we're not doing it. And we need to, we've seen that market surveys are showing us that people want this. People want walkability. And the only way to get it with the services you need, is to bring the density back in. And maybe we don't have to do it at the mega scale. In Vancouver, I'm very proud of one of our city's innovations, and it's this. Household sizes have shrunk to about 2.6 people, which I think is almost the same as the UK. But our houses used to be full of people. So neighborhoods have emptied out. Our inner suburbs have emptied out of people. We need those people back. So what can you do? Every single-family home in Vancouver now has permission to have a legal suite in the basement and to turn their back alley garage, into a laneway house. And I got this from an architect, right? And like all architects, he's like, yeah, we got to render it full of people in the back alley. I actually got him to take some people out. But actually, those people are starting to appear. The alleys, once they get enough of these places, are starting to become lively and convivial and warm places. And it could be the greatest urban infill project on the continent if everybody takes it up. Okay, I want to move past residential architecture and talk about public space. There's been a lot of discussion of placemaking here. And so I think it's important to acknowledge, in this future of shrinking household sizes and density, the public realm really is going to be our living room, as it is for Team Happy City here, my mother. So I was very interested in this question in New York City. How does the public realm make us feel? How does it change the way we feel as we move through it? So I took some of this car company's cash and called in another neuroscientist, Colin Ellard. And we created a psychophysiological tour of the Lower East Side in New York City. So Colin has these gadgets. These are skin conductance monitors. They measure your relative level of arousal as you move through the city, how excited you are. He also gave people Blackberries. Remember the old Canadian invention? And they were hacked so you could punch in your subjective well-being. So how happy do I feel right now? We learned a lot of things. I'm going to tell you one only, and it's this. It's the most interesting. People felt more aroused and more happy here on this jumbled up, messy, gritty old tenement block than they did down the street in front of this exemplary, I think award-winning, mixed-use building on East Houston Street in New York City. So what's going on here? Well, here, many fine grain, small shops, services, openings, things going on. That's the big difference. Over here, you have retail on the bottom floor, but guess what? It's one giant Whole Foods where you can get a great kale salad, healthy, but there is a doorway at either end of the block, and that's it. We know from Jan Gehl's work that people walk faster here. We know from Canadian studies that older adults get older more quickly when they don't have destinations to walk to. And we found that, oh, guess what? People are also happier over here. But it goes beyond that. Our next, I'm not doing peer-reviewed research, obviously, but I'll tell you about what we did, because we did use some robust methods. We went to Seattle next, and we thought, does this have a social effect? Does design have a social effect in the public realm? So we got volunteers to promise to look as stupid as possible and hold up maps, pretending to be lost tourists. So here's one of our actors. She's a very intelligent woman, but not at the moment. And they're just standing there, looking like deer in headlights. And we sent them out in front of different typologies. So here are the typologies. Again, blank environment, but it could easily be that translucent or frosted glass wall. And then this, another, fairly gritty, but active frontage. Same neighborhood. And what we found was, I think, remarkable. People were much more likely to offer help unsolicited to our volunteers in the active environment than they were in the dead environment. Even though they're reporting, I think, the same level of social trust in both places when we surveyed, they were even more likely to give our volunteers their cell phones or to take them where they wanted to go. So to me, it's remarkable. I mean, we're hoping that the proper academics will pick this up. But if this stuff is true, then we're in a bit of a crisis situation, because now as suburban retailers are re-inhabiting our city cores, following the people back downtown, we risk this. Again, in Vancouver, it's so depressing. So the big boxes are coming in and big boxing these blocks. Dead, dead, dead. It doesn't have to be this way. Oops. Look, it's a great building. I'm just saying, if we did that same study here, you're getting people moving very swiftly along what should be one of your most social places in the city. Anyway, just saying. And I meant to take that out. So anyway, it doesn't have to be this way. Again, one block up in Vancouver, just one block up, Grosvenor Properties came to the city and said, hey, we want to build a Home Depot in the heart of your city, right by City Hall. And guess what the planner said? Any guesses? Go for it. No, they said, go. Of course we want Home Depot. We want business. But you're putting your big box on the second floor. And you can put another big box on top of that. And then we're going to put some residential on top of that. And because it's Vancouver, they'll get a herb garden and they can grow whatever, But what they insisted upon, this is a very empowered planning department, was small-scale retail frontage along the edge. There are 9 doorways along here. So what you get is a streetscape that's lively, social, safe, healthier, and if our studies are right, then, maybe also kinder. So we can have it all. And the reason I say that is because somebody from Grosvenor I interviewed years later, and they said, oh, we're so happy the city forced us to do that. We're so grateful. Why? Because they're earning much more per square foot on the small retail at the front than they are from their anchor clients. One more point. This is a matter of life and death. So in 1995, when a devastating heat wave hit the U.S. Midwest in Chicago, 700 people died in the course of 3 days. Guess who they were? Yeah, many were poor, many didn't have air conditioning, but one thing they all had in common was social disconnection. Well, how does design play into this? Well, you take 2 poor neighborhoods, and if you want to learn about this, the author of this study's name is Eric Kleinenberg, who's written about it extensively. 2 poor neighborhoods, one of them where the fabric had been ripped through and destroyed by the high modernists, and one of them where you still have the old mom and pop shops. And there was 1/10 the number of dead in the social, fine-grained neighborhood. Why? Because vulnerable people knew other people because they were getting out onto the street already. They knew people. They were connected. They had support. As I was walking through London the other day, I felt like I felt some shame, actually, because if you move through parts of London, the parts that have embraced walkability and the bike share and great spaces and pedestrianization of streets, you realize that very few humans can afford to live there anymore. And that the greatest issue, I think, in our cities is actually the issue of equity and affordability. And it's hit my city too. I mean, I can't afford to buy a new house in my city. I'm going to have to move out. So not to complain, but so while we talk about these issues, who's benefiting from the changes we're making? So to drill into that a little bit more, aside from the political and philosophical question about equity, let's just throw some science at it for a moment. When you're thinking about the social city and the social life of we humans, you have to acknowledge our sense of status. We're constantly comparing ourselves to who we were in the past, who we may be in the future, but we're especially comparing ourselves to everybody else. This is Robert Sapolsky. He spent a decade living with baboons in the Sahel. And what he found was the low-status baboons, the ones who were always getting pushed around by the alpha males, their systems were full of stress hormones. And these stress hormones were the kind of hormones that are great when you're being chased by a lion or something. Tiger, I guess. Well, whatever, I don't know. Something scary in the jungle with big teeth or in the Sahel. But they're terrible for long-term health. I mean, stress is awful. And they die younger. And guess what? It's the same with humans. You're familiar with the Whitehall studies? Could you put your hands up if you are, and I won't go deeply into them? Oh, okay. Well, these are landmark and very important British studies studying the health and lives of British civil servants. And what they found was the lower you are on the ladder, the faster you get sick and die. Even when people have access to the same degree of health care. So being low in status is awful, and it's unhealthy, and it's deadly. Okay, so let's think back to urbanism. Let's think back to the systems of our city. Who has high status on our streets, and who has low status? This is outside the Novotel. You could say, oh, this is a remnant of traffic in towns, right, from the 60s. That great report that I think had good intentions. But what I see here is pedestrians being corralled in cage-like environments. If you want to cross this intersection, actually, from the other side, you have to cross, to get to that corner by the new Apple ad, you have to make 3 crossings. So very low status. It's a place that says don't walk. It actually says something much stronger, but I'm not allowed to use that word. So that's one thing. The other thing here is surveys of commuters are showing that people who travel by bicycle experience more joy and less fear, rage, and sadness than any other commuters out there. We know that in the UK, your children, 75% of the kids here say they want to bike or walk to school. But I think only a quarter of them do so. But the rest of us want to do it too. In fact, 60% of people in most cities say, they wouldn't mind trying to bike. They wouldn't mind trying to cross the city on the bike. It looks cool, but they're too scared or they think it would make them uncomfortable. So what's happening in your cities? Well, the only option is what you call vehicular cycling. The movement that came up several decades ago that said the cyclists had to act like cars. Well, guess what? Who's willing to do this? Here he is. He's 30 years old, and he's a male. Only about 5% of the population are brave enough to take the kamikaze approach. So again, terribly unfair, terribly inefficient if you want people to move with the maximum freedom. And then there's transit. Speaking of status again. This is an ad GM ran in my city. Just reminding you that if you take transit, you're a creep or a weirdo, and there's a way out. But, it's not that funny, really, because we treat our transit systems as though they're handouts to the poor. And not only that, they're underfunded, and they have to wait behind cars. This is Berlin, but it could easily have been us on the bus in Birmingham yesterday, waiting behind single occupant vehicles. It's wrong, it's unfair, and it creates status anxiety with the traveler. This is why people who are on transit report very high levels of stress and frustration. So before coming back to New York City, this is why I feel it was very important to remind you of the name of a very great guy. This is the person who launched the Happy City movement. His name is Enrique Peñalosa. He was the mayor of Bogota, Colombia in the end of the last century. Now, it was a bad time there, right? They had a civil war spilling into the city from around the country. Traffic was awful. Violence was high. Congestion, brutal. Pollution, you name it. It was a terrible place. Enrique promised not to make his citizens richer because he didn't feel he could, at least not rich enough to catch up with the Americans. So instead, he said, we're going to build happiness in our city. And how do we do that? And his approach was not empirically based. It was a philosophical approach. For Enrique, happiness was about equity, giving everybody access to the riches of the city, as is their due. So what does that look like? Well, it means, number one, when JICA, which is the Japanese International Development Cooperation Agency, basically the aid agency from Japan, said, hey, we want to help you build a $6 billion freeway system around the city, elevated freeways, because the Japanese sell cars, right? Instead, what they did, they poured their money into parks, schools, daycares, high-status libraries in the poorest parts of the city. But not just that. I want to give you one example of a system change they created that was purely about equity, and it's this. Does anybody know what this piece of infrastructure is? You're urban nerds. So if you go to a regular audience, people say, oh, this is the airport in Copenhagen? I don't know. Yeah, it's BRT. So this is a bus station. So they took the best and fastest roads. I know everybody's doing BRT now, but this was a very significant beginning, right after Curitiba. The best and fastest roads, and they gave them over to people who were willing to share space, right? The bus had to be a sexy red color, have a sexy name, Transmilenio. But more importantly than that, someone who was poor in that city could now cross the city just as quickly as their boss in the sports car. Now, why is that really worth talking about for most people in this room who do have money? Well, for this reason. So many people switched modes, and it's happened in Mexico City and other cities as well, that everybody across the city 20% faster. So in other words, when you build and design and create systems that are fair for equity, everybody benefits. It's good for us all. So I think I hope we can keep that in mind. So going from the top level down to the micro, before coming back to New York City, I have a feeling I only have like 5 minutes left, right? Yeah, 5 minutes? Well, you all know about Vauban, right? We don't need to talk about that. Boom, boom, boom. Nice place. Slow. One thing I found very intriguing through the course of this work is to find that sometimes the biggest changes are tiny, and they're not the ones that are led by governments. It doesn't mean that governments shouldn't be active. Right? Let me show you this example. So in Portland, these neighbors were very frustrated, not just with traffic moving through their neighborhood, but with the sense that they didn't know each other or care about each other. Until one day, the children suggested, well, why don't we go out and turn our intersection into a public piazza? And this will join us all together again into a kind of a village. Because in so many American cities, they just didn't build that public space. So they marched out into the intersection together. And being Portland, of course, it was all hippie swirls and colors and whatnot. And they had a great time. And no sooner had they done this than an engineer came down from City Hall and said, this is public space, people. That means nobody's allowed to use it. But they had a very progressive mayor at the time. So they won support from the mayor. They were able to replicate this in neighborhood after neighborhood. But the key thing here is it was driven by neighbors. Now, it's a nice story, isn't it? But it's supported by empirical evidence. Jan Semenza, who now works for the European CDC, was one of these neighbors in one of these neighborhoods. He hated living in the USA. He found it so disconnected. And he and his neighbors built one of these intersection repairs, but he had his public health students study the effects. So they were surveying people on all kinds of, I can't remember, the psychological scales. And what they found was there was a blast radius of positive psychological health around every intersection repair for blocks around. So people reported sleeping better. They said life was getting easier. They reported trusting their neighbors more. They shared with their neighbors more. Crime went down, and it goes on and on and on. So in this case, what was interesting to me is the design didn't matter at all. What mattered is they got together, and they did it together. So something transformative happens when we get together to work or to play. And we're changed. Which brings me back to New York City. That early October night in New York City, when we prepared our grand experiment, our machine for happiness, we actually called it Love Night, and they ran it in timeout, so people did show up. In fact, they came by the hundreds, partly because it was free. So the place filled up. People shared the hot chocolate. They did the stranger unstranger. They put on the heat-sensitive garments, and then Paul stood up and started demanding that they hug. And they did. First they hugged Paul, because he insisted. Then they started hugging their friends. Then they started hugging their friends' friends. Then they started hugging strangers. And, by the end of the night, it was just this giant hug fest. And the Guggenheim curators were kind of appalled. This is not high art. It's not the Bilbao effect. But we felt great. Maybe it was the oxytocin running through our system. But that feeling, that's not why I'm telling you this story, because something else happened that night. And what happened was this. We were testing people without actually planning to test people. We had a game on site and online called Urbanology. Groups of people played together, and the game asked people about their values. What kind of city do you want? What kind of society do you want? Here's an example of the kind of question that was asked. Do you think we should raise the minimum wage for people who work through the night? Now, typically, New York City, our response was 90%, hell no. This is New York City. You come here, you tough it out, right? But this night, after just an hour of superficial, convivial contact with strangers, the results turned on their head. From 90% no, we went to 80% yes. People voted together for a greener, slower, more sustainable, more fair city, even though they knew that this would cost them more in taxes and in goods and services. So that brief moment of conviviality, it brought out the best in us, even for a short time. When you think about it, that's just the kind of change we need if we're going to be dealing with the challenges of this urban age. Inequity, resource scarcity, population growth, climate change. We can't hope to solve any of these issues if we as a society are disconnected and isolated and indifferent. Now, I'm not saying you all need to go and start hugging people. I mean, I know where we are. Although you can I'm happy to hug you when we're done. But we have evidence now to show that every time we have positive encounters with other people in our cities, it brings out the best in us. It brings out the pro-social. It brings out the compassion in us. We also have enough evidence. Of course, we need to do more experimentation, but we have enough evidence to support the notion that the places we design and build and the systems we create, they change how we come together. They change how we feel about other people, and they change how we regard others in our city. So it's time we started pouring our resources into building, understanding, and building the social city. We need to invest in happier places. We need to plan for happiness. We need to build for happiness. I would say we need to zone for it, but that's a North American concept. But this stuff isn't silly. If we do make these investments, we'll have cities that are healthier, are wealthier, are more resilient, are more connected. We'll have cities that bring out the best in us. And, as far as I can see, that's a recipe for a happier city. Well, I look forward to hearing how all of you are making your own cities happier, or if you're even okay with the word. But thanks for hearing me out today.